The morning of August 6th, 1945, started with a strange kind of relief. For weeks, the skies over Japan had been filled with the roar of engines from saturation bombings. But on this particular morning, there was just silence. A 5-year-old girl named Kyoku stepped outside with her brother. Her parents told them to go play. The sky was clear. There were no fleets of bombers. It felt for a moment like a lucky day. And then she heard it. Not a fleet, just one engine. Kyoku looked up. She thought, oh, only one airplane. We really are lucky today. But then the world turned white. A wall of flame. Her home was gone. Her parents were gone. Her little brother, standing just feet away from her, was gone. All of Hiroshima was gone. 19 years later, a teenage farm boy in Indiana named Max Carter sat in a church pew and listened to Kyoku tell that story. Max was a patriotic kid. He was planning to join the military, but as he listened to her describe that lucky day, something inside of him broke.
And I knew then and there I could not participate in any system that made that kind of horror possible.
When the world demands violence, what does it take to say no? And once you've said no, what comes next?
The Quaker
Podcast.
Story, spirit, sound.
I'm Zach Jackson, and welcome back to Season 3 of the Quaker Podcast. In this season, we've been digging into the internet's most asked questions about Quakers, and today we're tackling the one that spikes every time the news cycle turns violent. Why are Quakers pacifists? Now, if you type that into Google, you'll probably get a simple answer. But if you ask a Quaker, it gets messier.
Because I think many people aren't aware that the vast majority of Quakers who have ever lived have not been pacifists. And that is because the word pacifism was only invented just over a century ago, whereas Quakers have been around for nearly 4 centuries.
That's Tim G., General Secretary of the Friends World Committee for Consultation. Pacifism, he explained, is a political strategy. It's often defined by what you don't do. You don't fight. You don't engage. But early Friends weren't interested in political strategies. They were interested in a spiritual reality.
So we have our peace testimony. It's rooted in our experience of the divine. It's rooted in our reading of Scripture. But the peace testimony is a cumulative expression of how God has spoken to people, how people have acted on it, and how they've reflected on it, usually with the aid of Scripture.
The peace testimony isn't a rule book or a list of best practices for avoiding conflict. It's a living wisdom tradition. And while modern critics often frame nonviolence as a naive rejection of the real world, Tim argues that the biblical narrative from Genesis to Revelation tells a different story.
The Bible starts with a state of shalom. It ends with a state of shalom. We have, of course, the Jesus's ministry and the Sermon on the Mount, which begins with the Beatitudes that build up to "Blessed are the peacemakers." He then works into saying that killing is wrong, but goes way beyond that. Asks us to work in reconciliation and work against various forms of injustice. The first word of the risen Christ is peace. But when you see in the New Testament letters, it says greetings at the top. If it was read in Hebrew, the chances are that they were saying shalom. So, God's shalom goes right through the Bible.
Many of us tend to assume that the Christian world is hopelessly divided on this, that there are two equally valid theological arguments wrestling for dominance, the just war camp and the peace camp. But when you really get people in a room, that debate often vanishes.
The vast majority of times when I would have this conversation with other Christians in an ecumenical setting, I think we would agree on the biblical basis of peacemaking. I think we would agree that war is against the will of God. I think very few people nowadays use biblical arguments for war, where it would very practically go into the more rational arguments, the kind of, but what would you do if you were in such and such a situation?
The rational argument, as Tim calls it, is the pivot that we make when the theology gets inconvenient. We talk about necessary evils, about geopolitics and defense. We look at the fruit of war rather than the root that caused it. But early friends like George Fox and Margaret Fell weren't looking at the fruit. They were looking at the soul.
I think the peace testimony is about identifying what the seeds of war are, what the causes of war are. Depending on your reading or your translation of the Epistle of James, says that wars begin with greed inside us, lusts in the soul, according to the King James Version. And that was the version that Fox and Fell and others quoted.
Early Quakers didn't adopt peace just because the Bible told them so. They adopted it because they had seen viscerally what war does to the human spirit. Many of the first Quakers were veterans of the English Civil War. They had killed men in muddy fields for causes that they were told were just.
Many of the early Quakers came right out of the New Model Army. They had been soldiers and recognized the horrors of war and came to a position through their experience as well as the teachings of early Quaker itinerant ministers that to be a true Christian meant to give up the sword.
That's Max Carter again. He's a retired professor from Guilford College. He told me the story of George Fox sitting in a jail cell in 1650.
And was offered early release if he would join the militia. He was recognized as having leadership abilities. And his response was, I can't, because I live in the virtue of that life and power which takes away the occasion for war.
I live in the virtue of that life and power which takes away the occasion for war. But living in that virtue isn't like a switch that you flip. We're so deeply embedded in a violent culture that sometimes we don't even notice it. Max tells a famous story about William Penn, the founder of Pennsylvania.
Penn grew up wearing one of those military uniforms that sons of military folk did, including a sword and a scabbard. And apocryphally, Penn went to Fox and said, now that I've become a friend, a Quaker, how long can I wear my sword? And supposedly Fox said, wear it as long as thou canst, implying that eventually the light of Christ would lead him to give it up. And indeed, Penn gave up his sword.
Peace is an internal transformation, not just an external behavior. But while individual transformation takes time, political realities sometimes force clarity. By 1660, the English Civil War was over. King Charles II had returned to the throne, and he was looking for revenge against the radicals who had executed his father. Quakers needed to make it very clear, very quickly, that they were not a threat to him.
It was an epistle sent to King Charles II when he ascended the throne. And it was more a kind of a political statement that, not us, don't go after us.
Margaret Fell wrote that letter that would become a cornerstone of Quaker pacifism for centuries. She wrote, "We are the harmless and innocent people of God, and we cannot fight with carnal weapons."
There's a difference between "I live in the virtue of that life and power which takes away the occasion for war," and a statement that "don't go after us because we aren't those folk."
It was, in many ways, a survival tactic, and while it set a standard, it didn't settle the debate. For the next 300 years, Quakers wrestled with that standard. During the American Revolution, free Quakers broke away to fight for independence. During the Civil War, many abolitionist friends felt that ending slavery was worth picking up a rifle. The peace testimony has never been a monolith. It has always been a struggle. By 1964, in the Quaker belt of Indiana, Max Carter was living in a community where the peace testimony had become flexible.
So I had an uncle, oddly enough, who'd actually been a conscientious objector during World War II, who was a staunch advocate of the war in Vietnam, because he said, and I remember his words, shocked me, he said, "We've got to kill the commies for Christ."
Max was 16. The Vietnam War was raging, and he had a plan to do his duty, to serve his country, without getting his hands too dirty.
And so I thought, I'll join the Coast Guard. Not knowing then that would lead to hijacking Venezuelan tankers on the high seas later. But I figured if I joined the Coast Guard, I would satisfy the military obligation if I were drafted, but I probably wouldn't have to shoot anyone. Patrol the Mississippi against something rather.
It was a somewhat uneasy but manageable compromise. That is, until he heard Kyoku's experience of Hiroshima.
All that thought of kind of compromising and joining the Coast Guard when I turned 18 or when drafted evaporated. And I knew then and there I could not participate in any system that made that kind of horror possible. And that's when I became a conscious objector.
In that moment, Max realized he couldn't participate in this system. But the system had other plans. He was 18, he was healthy, and the United States government was calling him to war. That story after the break.
Since the earliest days of the United Nations, Quakers have held a presence at the UN headquarters in New York and Geneva, supporting the international community in the collective effort of sustaining peace. But we know today that the UN and other institutions are facing unprecedented challenges: shrinking civic space, increased military spending, and even questioning the basic value of international diplomacy. The Quaker United Nations office carries forward with engaging UN diplomats and staff around promoting justice, peace, and sustainability at the UN, and they are hiring 2 program assistants to work alongside their representatives. This 12-month paid entry-level position is ideal for recent graduates and provides the opportunity to gain hands-on experience with international peace building through Quaker values at the UN in New York. Applications are due February 16th. You can apply or find more information at QUNO.org. That's QUNO.org. Okay, back to the show.
Welcome back. Max Carter had applied for conscientious objector status, and usually this is where the story ends. The CO stays home, works a desk job, and keeps their hands clean. But Max wasn't looking for an exemption from danger. He was looking for an alternative to violence. So he asked the draft board to send him to war in the Middle East.
The Quaker peace testimony is not about just avoidance of war. It's about how do you live your life in such a way that you help remove the occasion for war. So I wanted to go to a war zone.
He ended up at the Friends School in Ramallah, in the West Bank.
It was in a war zone, and it was Quaker. And I applied to teach there in 1970 and was accepted. I got dropped down in the middle of the war of attrition. Students, Palestinians whose families had been there for millennia, talking about the impact of the occupation, writing essays about joining the Fedayeen and wanting to drive out the occupiers. And I had to start reading, what is this all about? And after 2 years of that, you became even more convinced that war is not the answer, that both sides have used violence to get their way. And in some cases, the more powerful of the parties, succeeded in imposing a negative peace by crushing the other. But that does not work. And it just continues a cycle of violence. And so I came out of that experience even more committed to the peace testimony and to supporting those nonviolent responses to oppression and occupation and colonialism.
Everyone says that they want peace, but it often feels impossible. We're told constantly that violence is simply the nature of the universe. Recently, Stephen Miller, White House advisor, said on television that we live in a world governed by, quote, iron laws of strength and force. He said essentially that if a nation has the power to take what it wants, it should, and anything else is dangerously naive. That's a terrifying worldview. But is he wrong? That does seem to be the way that the world works, right? I put that question to Bridget Moix. She's the General Secretary of the Friends Committee on National Legislation, the Quaker lobby in Washington, D.C.
We are taught history based on wars. But most of the people, most of the time, in most of the world, are taking care of each other, are cooperating, are figuring out problems, are working as a community. We rely on people, each other, with a blind faith all the time. Every time I get onto an airplane or a bus, I think about this. Every time I think about all the people that it requires to get food, that ends up on my table. I mean, we actually are living peacefully all the time in many, many ways, alongside the wars and the violence and the injustice. Those two things exist at the same time. And so we have to keep reminding ourselves and recapturing the real part of our reality that is the peace that does exist, even amid the war and the violence.
We get distracted by the noise of violence, but if you look away from the headlines, you realize that peace isn't some impossibly naive dream. It's the social contract we're already living by. It's the flight that lands on time. It's the grocery store shelves being fully stocked. It's the mundane, boring reliability of people simply doing what they said they would do. We don't notice it because it works. It's just the quiet, functional hum of human cooperation. War is the moment that hum stops.
I really believe that we are meant to be connected to one another, that the divine spark in each of us is a divine thread. It is a divine web that weaves us together as a human family. And war and violence break that thread.
The web is already there. Our job as people of peace is to just stop snapping the threads. But when violence is at its loudest, when the threads are snapping everywhere, that is when it's hardest to believe. It's easy to trust in peace when things are calm, but what about when the entire world is on fire? Bridget likes to remind people that FCNL, this Quaker lobby, wasn't founded during peacetime. It was founded in 1943, in the midst of World War II.
One of the words that I love that is in that original document where Quakers gathered and established FCNL is that they saw that it would be a new adventure. And they were very serious about the work. They named issues that were weighing on Friends, from conscientious objection to humanitarian relief to civil rights, the big issues of the day in this country that they thought this small group of Friends might have a way of working on in Washington. And they also had that spirit that I find for doing the work of peace building as Friends is so important, which is that sense of walking lightly over the earth, answering that of God in everyone and bringing some sense of adventure and joy to this very difficult work in the midst of a very difficult time.
If they could bring joy and adventure to peace work in 1943, we can certainly do it today. But the doubt still creeps in. Bridget was recently speaking with a young activist who felt overwhelmed by the sheer size of the American war machine.
She said to me at some point, well, who's going to stop the U.S.? And I said, the only people who can stop the U.S. from continuing down this path at this time is us. It's the people of the U.S. who have a vote and who have a voice and who can do this work of advocating with our government for a better world.
It's a heavy charge, and if you try to carry it alone, you will be crushed by its weight.
It can feel like you're not making much progress. Certainly the times that we are in can feel just overwhelming. And I just find again and again that the community that Quakers have built around doing peace and justice work as part of our faith, as fundamental to who we are as a faith community, is such a source of strength and resilience for me. Standing on the shoulders of those who came before and trying to become the shoulders for those who will come after. That is a real gift to walk alongside so many people over time.
It falls to us, collectively, to shape the world that the next generation will inherit. But looking at the headlines today, the forecast is terrifyingly unclear. Tim G. told me that the Friends World Committee for Consultation is trying to intervene in that forecast. They are making plans for the year 2030, the 2,000-year anniversary of the Sermon on the Mount, when Jesus famously said, "Blessed are the peacemakers." The goal is to bring Christians from all traditions together to make a unified global case for peace. It should be a celebration, but when Tim looks at the predictions for 2030, he sees two very different futures competing for the timeline.
One news story says that we'll be in World War III by then, and the other news story says that there'll be some kind of tentative but fragile peace in a number of the hot wars of the world. But, whichever of those is our world in 2030, we're going to need people who know about peace, who are motivated for peace, who want to work for peace, who want to advocate that resources are put into peacemaking, but we need people who, in the essence of their being, or even from beyond their essence of their being, have something coming into them that they can reflect out into the world that works for peace. That's what we're going to need to get through this. And that's something that a faith community can support and offers. And Quakerism is one of those faith communities that's doing that at present.
Whether we are facing World War III or a fragile peace, the mandate is the same. We need people who know how to weave our common threads back together. I asked him what his ultimate hope was. Not a strategy, not a policy, but a dream.
I have an answer. It's just I almost daren't say it because it seems so distant from where we are. But I do believe that there's that of God in everyone. And I also believe that if people see that of God in their neighbour, then they won't be able to harm them. I also believe that the vast majority of the world's Christians, and indeed the vast majority of people of faith in the world, believe that war is against the will of God. So I suppose my dream is that people of faith won't kill one another, or anybody else for that matter. I think that's my dream, and I can't work out if it's extremely modest or if it's, wild beyond our dreams, beyond our imaginations. Maybe it's both. I wonder if listeners to this podcast pray, I might ask that you might pray for such a thing, if that's a way that you pray, or if the way that you pray is to open your heart and listen, that you might open your heart and listen for what role you might have in this great change that needs to happen.
Thank you for listening, and thank you to our guests, Tim G., Max Carter, and Bridget Moix. For discussion questions and a transcript of today's episode, make sure you check out QuakerPodcast.com. And while you're there, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss a thing. This episode was hosted, produced, and edited by me, Zach Jackson. John Watts wrote and produced the music. The Quaker Podcast is a part of The Quaker Project. We are a nonprofit Quaker media organization dedicated to giving Quakerism a platform for the 21st century. If you like what we're up to, please consider becoming a monthly supporter. You can go to QuakerPodcast.com and click support in the top right window. It takes less than 5 minutes, and we really appreciate it. And now, your daily Quaker message, as read by Susan Majimbo.
Margaret Fell, 1660. We are a people that follow after those things that make for peace, love, and unity. It is our desire that others' feet may walk in the same, and do deny and bear our testimony against all strife and wars and contentions that come from the lusts, that war in the members, that war in the soul, which we wait for and watch for in all people, and love and desire the good of all.
To get Quaker wisdom in your inbox every day, go to dailyquaker.com. That's dailyquaker.com.